Okay, so recording. If I can ask everybody to mute themselves now, please, that'd be brilliant. So refreshments, obviously you are in your own cafe at the moment, so please feel free to pop off at any time and obviously get your own refreshments. We will stop for about 5 minutes around about 8:15, 10 past 8:15, depending on how we're getting on. But yeah, so please just help yourselves as ever. Okay, so the Wellingborough Climate Action Project, and that's our little acronym at the top, WCAP. This is a 12-month project. We started it in February this year. It's hosted by Glamis Hall for All. And Glamis Hall, for those that don't know, is a community centre and day centre up on the Queensway estate in Wellingborough. And it's also hosted by the Wellingborough Eco Group. The project is funded by North Northants Council. And the aims of the project is to help all of us better understand the challenges around the climate emergency, to bring people, business and communities together, to learn how we can reduce our climate impacts, and to create better and more sustainable ways of living and working at the same time. The project stages, we started off doing climate conversations. That was back in March. A few of us then went on carbon literacy training, so carbon awareness training. And then since then, we've been running these 11 energy saving and sustainability workshops. We'll be talking a bit later about the next steps, but they can include us doing more detailed work on some of the one or two of the areas that we've been focusing on as part of the workshops. We also had a plan to create a community forum or join in with a community forum. And there's a few other things that we're going to consider tonight as well. Okay, so the sustainability workshops, they started in May, and this is the last one at the moment. We may be doing some more, but this is the last scheduled one. We've had 11, as I say, and they've covered top topics, including all of the items here on this list. So we did a few at the beginning around energy saving, understanding about bills, doing some more detailed work, things like insulation. We learned about renewable power and renewable heating. We had a session on how to measure our own carbon impact, our own climate impact, and to learn how to, some practical things we can do to cut our own emissions. We did a session on transitioning, because the way we want to, okay, we can cut our carbon footprints, but really it's talking about changing the ways we live and work and transitioning to more sustainable ways of living. So we talked about transitioning, sustainable homes and businesses. So Kieran might have enjoyed that session, so or been able to add to it as well. We learned how to perhaps go about retrofitting our own homes or business premises. We did focus on homes, but the same is required for many community and business premises. We looked at sustainable food and also looked at food waste, well, food waste generally, and how we cope with that and its impact on the climate. And we covered sustainable transport. And the last session we did was about pollution and how to support nature effectively. So some really, really big topics. We didn't manage to, obviously there's quite a lot we could have focused on within any one of these topics really. So we've covered a fair bit of ground in the last few months. And tonight we're going to be having a look at adapting to climate impacts. So a lot of what we've been talking about is how things are happening, how we can mitigate, how we can reduce our carbon impacts. But tonight we're going to have a look at, how do we cope with the baked-in changes that are very, very difficult for us to change or adjust. Okay. Yeah, so that's tonight's session, and we're also going to, well, I'll do a little bit more on that. So let's get started then this evening. Are there any questions before we kick off from anybody? Okay. So tonight's session, we're going to have a look at what is adaptation, give you some examples of what it is, and I'm going to move that so I can see what it says. and what where we're trying to adapt to, or what we're trying to adapt to, how we can adapt, what adaptations do we need to do in and around Northamptonshire and Wellingborough, as well as obviously more global challenges. And we're going to discuss we're going to have a look at some ideas of, some positive adaptations that can be done. And then to wind up the programme tonight, we're going to just do a bit of a review of all the sessions that we've been discussing, see what your thoughts are, consider what next really in terms of the climate action project. And I've also got a few bits of news to share, and other people might have as well. So it's quite a packed agenda tonight. So it's a bit of a rounding up day as well as sharing on this new topic. Okay, so I'm moving along. Okay, so I'm asking you all, you can all unmute yourself now, because we're going to have a bit more audience participation this week. Can anybody tell me what is climate adaptation?
Good question.
Got to be one for Kieran, surely.
I would say it's probably learning to live with the changes to climate as it gets worse, or well, maybe not worse, but changes.
Yeah. Thank you. Any other thoughts on what climate adaptation might be? Thank you for your contribution, Kieran.
Is what we've got to do right now.
We've got to adapt.
We're probably past the tipping point, aren't we? There's no, we've got to learn to live with
yeah,
very cold winters, very hot summers, droughts. Shall I carry on?
No, not too much, because there's all of this in the presentation still to do. But thank you very much.
I suppose there's different kinds of adaptation. There's biological, where we could all evolve into camels, but I think we need the technological and maybe social in terms of expectations, where we find ways of doing things in less good climate, but we continue on and try to give the best lives and encourage the possibility of humanity to develop and overcome these things, which can only happen in the long term.
Thank you. Are there any other thoughts about adaptation? Thank you very much, everybody.
Is it not? Sorry, go on, Greg.
I can say something. Well, normally, if a species or creatures adapt, there's usually some sort of change that is afoot, and if they don't change, then they more than likely might not survive. So if they want to survive, then they need to make changes and somehow need to work out what those changes are to be able to survive into future generations.
Thank you. Jonathan, did you want to say something?
Sorry, Jonathan.
No, sorry, we talked exactly at the same time. I was going to say that it's making plans, sustainable plans for mitigation, and implementing structures or defences against what might happen. A bit like the Thames has got a tidal dam, hasn't it? Basically at the front that can be raised or lowered. I think things like that are going to be a lot more important as we move forward, but also sort of making enough water storage, for instance. Like you could argue at the moment that we haven't sort of stored enough gas to last us over the winter, because they're thinking about having power cuts of up to sort of 3 hours a day, because nobody's actually sort of thought of it sustainably and thought, what happens if? I think that's what needs to be answered.
Thank you everybody for your contributions. So here's a few notes I wrote on the topic. So adaptation is where we have to change the way we do things in response to the impacts of the climate crisis. which we cannot stop. So there's some of those impacts are baked in now. You know, we talk about the whole globe really aiming to try and keep global warming to 1.5 degrees, below 1.5 degrees. But there's many consequences that have already happened, and it will be very difficult to change them. So as I say, global consequences happened already and are difficult to change. We have to learn to live with them and to adapt and try and reduce their impacts. And to a certain extent, also think about, you know, if we're more positive and we're more on the front foot about it, we can actually do more prevention as well. As I think that's what Jonathan was alluding to. We can actually do more prevention things by thinking ahead and considering. And also, if you think about it, so all of this is really called adaptation, and it's so when really there's two main terms that really apply to the whole climate crime. Well, there's a lot of terms, but two main strategies, and one is to mitigate the risks and try and reduce the likely, you know, try and reduce the planet warming in the first place, but the other is to adapt to what has already happened and find ways of living with that. And the good news is that we as human beings are very good at adapting once we make our minds up to do it. So there is quite a few opportunities there. And obviously the faster we can reduce the CO2 emissions, the less we will need to adapt. But the longer we don't, the more we are going to have to adapt. And that's what I think many people are concerned about. So there could be some very big global changes affecting our planet and people and animals and other species. And it's our ability to cope and respond to those, really. So as I say, you know, mitigation, adaptation to the climate crisis. So the main way to fix the climate, I use that word fix, to respond to climate change is to mitigate, i.e. try and reduce CO2 equivalent emissions and do that rapidly. If we'd started to do that a lot earlier, we would need to adapt less than we do now and in the future. But since we've left change so late, many consequences are now irreversible in our lifetimes. It's not saying they're irreversible ever. They may just be, if they may be reversible, but it may take a very long time to do that. If we delay further and don't keep global temperature rises below 1.5 degrees, we will have to adapt much, much more, assuming that we can. Because I think, as Harry said, you start to reach tipping points and then a chain of reactions can happen, which we just may have to respond to and cope with. Okay, so what sort of things do we need to adapt to? I'll ask you that question first, and then I'm going to show you a little film. So, and of those things that we need to adapt to, which ones do you think are more likely to affect us in Northamptonshire, in Wellingborough? So what sort of things do we need to adapt to? That's the first question.
So I think one of the more obvious ones might be irregular water supply, which could mean drought. Well, it's likely to mean drought, and then it's likely to mean flooding. And I think we've all seen the effects of severe and immediate flooding in the town. So that for sure. In terms of drought, Britain's quite a wet country, and we can certainly manage better reservoirs if we want to. And I suppose it means for the flooding side, we need to sort out the drainage as well. And that might be a little bit more difficult to do.
Thank you. Any other thoughts of, thanks very much for that, Kevin. Any other thoughts of what we need to adapt to? What sort of climate consequences do we need to adapt to, Harry?
Food. We can't buy cauliflowers at the moment, not in toaster anyway. There's a shortage of cauliflower, so there will be the risk of vegetable shortages if we have another very hot summer or a very difficult to plant season over winter or early spring.
So you're saying, Harry, then that because of climate change impacts, that some of the food that we used to being able to grow in this country, for example, we might not be able to grow anymore, or it'd be harder for us to get much of a crop. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely, you've said it much better than me. Thank you, Marion.
That's all right. So there's the food growing challenges because everything's getting warmer or wetter or whatever. Thank you. Any other thoughts on what other sort of things we're going to need to adapt to? We had a unique thing happened this summer, although it's not as unique. Well, it's unique, but it's getting less unique, I think. Something that you wouldn't usually associate with England happened this year.
I mean, the hot
Fires.
Yeah,
Fire.
they're very, very hot. They're very, 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 very hot weather. And obviously the flash fires that came with that. You know, I spoke to some people from the fire service a few weeks ago, and they said that was around here, and they said they were absolutely inundated throughout the summer with grass fires, field fires, and various other fires around the community. Way, way busier than they've been for a very long time. And I think if you spoke to fire service personnel across the country, that would be a story, particularly in the southeast, you know, because I think it was even hotter and drier in the southeast, but obviously also around the country. So, that's a really big one, that we're going to get much hotter or more frequent hotter days and longer heat waves as well. And we're starting to see that, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So heat and fire. Thank you.
It's all weather occurrences, isn't it? So we should be getting more flash floods. So we need to make sure that our drainage systems are up to scratch.
So more weather extremes then, that we're saying.
Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you. And so of those then, we've said about a few, but how many of those will actually apply, do you think, to Wellingborough?
I think most of them.
So yeah, issues with potentially with flooding, maybe water shortage, because I mean, I was surprised about how low the rainfall is now in the East Midlands and East Anglia area of the country. It's going very, very low. So we can have the weird situation, well, I'll say all this. We can have the weird situation where you could have flooding, you could have a number of flooding events in a year, but by the end of the year, you've had less rainfall than you would usually have, if you see what I mean. So the overall rainfall is reducing, but it's all coming, when it does come, it comes all in one go. That's something that's becoming more common, isn't it? Okay, any other thoughts on that then before I just see if I can get this film to work?
I'd just say energy use and changing that.
Energy use.
Both like sources and the sort of expectations of when we can use energy.
Use and sources. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kieran. Okay, let's see if we can do this. That work? No. Okay, I'll just have to copy the thing and stick it in YouTube. Another one now. Can you see my menu there?
Nope.
You see the slides still?
Yeah.
What's going on? Okay, where's YouTube gone? Come back. I can't copy this now.
Add to favourites, it says.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how to do that. I know. Excuse me a second. Sorry about this.
Hello again.
You want to chat amongst yourself for a second? Or just get the link?
That's what I was trying to read. Oh dear.
I was just checking now, but I do have to go in about 5 minutes or so, just because I had other stuff on tonight. But I'll
Okay,
stay around for that. Sorry.
it's okay. If you want to, don't know what one.
He's been well briefed, Marion. Crikey, we had a very long conversation this afternoon at Sustainability Live.
Wasn't that long?
Well, we had a lovely conversation, I think is the word.
There you go.
We squeezed a lot in.
Right, now let me share it. No,
We
don't.
know enough about climate.
No, we don't. Hang on a minute. Oh, I've got to share the screen. Okay. Can you all see that?
Yep.
Right, okay. So I think I'll put it on full screen and then I'll play.
Change. It is time for decisions now.
Is that okay?
Coping with climate change. What does that mean? Climate has always determined how we live. And when it changed in the past, we adapted. So, what's new about adapting to climate change today? Shouldn't we focus on other challenges, such as education, unemployment, and economic development? Sure enough, the climate has always been changing. But the recent change, caused by our emission of gases such as carbon dioxide and methane that increase the greenhouse effect of the atmosphere, has happened in a much shorter time frame. As a result, the Earth is warming. This change in our climate is already leading to significant impacts. Glaciers are melting faster than expected. Sea level is on the rise. And it's very likely that droughts and extreme weather events like cyclones will become more frequent. These impacts destroy people's livelihoods and homes. They damage our infrastructure and disrupt communication and trade. Moreover, climate change is endangering development successes, and the poor and marginalized are often affected the most. Okay, climate change is evidently taking place. Whether it accelerates further depends on our lifestyle and economic activities. So, is it all about reducing carbon emissions? Well, even if we were to stop emissions instantly, the world would not stop warming immediately due to the amount of gases we've already emitted. That's why we must do both. Reduce greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to inevitable climate change. But how exactly can we adapt, considering that the precise extent and form of climate change aren't known? Climate projections will never be able to predict the future with absolute certainty, partly because the way in which the climate will change depends on our decisions in coming years. But do we really need certainty to make decisions? No. We routinely make decisions based on experience, facts, or insights available to us without knowing exactly what the future will bring. And while we don't know everything about future climate change, we know enough to act. But what exactly do we need to do differently? Basically, we need to bear in mind both current and future impacts of climate change. Climate projections do not translate into concrete strategies, but they can serve as guardrails for planning. We should consider how development plans, policies, and projects might be affected by climate change, and to what extent these in turn make climate change worse. One possible consequence of climate change is precipitation pattern changes. These may lead to both droughts and extreme rain, sometimes in the same place. We should ask ourselves how a land use plan must be changed in order to remain flexible in reacting to future challenges. What adaptation measures can help to minimize effects on the local economy and people's livelihoods? Coastal megacities worldwide are threatened by the adverse consequences of sea level rise, and extreme weather events. But what does an urban planner need to consider in order to make these cities climate resilient? What are the most suitable adaptation options? Clear criteria like urgency, costs, and political and social acceptance can help to prioritize adaptation options, such as flood preparedness measures, improvement of drainage systems, wetland restoration, and coastal management. Adaptation is a learning process. We all need to continuously improve our adaptation strategies, and making climate change adaptation a topic at all levels is important. There are many resources available that can support these activities, such as online information platforms like CI RASP. We need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to the impacts of climate change. And we must start acting today, together. Involve decision makers. Increase understanding about climate change. Create awareness about the need for society to adapt. These are important first steps. Preparing for possible things to come is much better than bearing the impacts of climate change without any protection. We know enough. Now let's adapt.
Oh, yeah. 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 Okay. Don't you like the little film? You see, I was drawing away very fast. It's funny, you know, I spend ages doing the slides and then I find a little film like that and it says quite a lot, really. Thanks very much for joining us, Kieran. Take care. Thank you. And the eagle-eyed amongst you will notice that Karen's joined us now. Can you hear us, Karen? Can you hear us, Karen?
Yeah, I can. I just couldn't find unmute.
Okay. Does everybody know Karen, and Karen know everyone? Can you see everybody here?
I can see everybody, yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
I'll join you all in person in a minute. But
okay. No problem. Thank you very much. Anyway, I'll go back to the slides. Were there any thoughts on that that film? What is sharing?
I think it was very good, Marion. Very American, but very good.
It's actually German.
Is it?
Yeah.
They say methane as well, do they? Okay.
I don't know. Anyway.
Oh, Kevin's got his hand up.
Have you? I can't see it. What,
yeah.
Do you want to ask a question, Kevin?
Sorry, just you're asking about that video. One thing it kind of skipped over was the willingness of the political class to actually do what's good for people. And I'm afraid the recent track history of the political class worldwide has been to do things diametrically opposed to the good of the people of the world. It may be a minor thing in that it's always happening, but we seem to be involved in a growing war at the moment, and it wouldn't take a great deal of good sense over the last 10 years to have averted that. So if we have an absolutely, spot on solution for this, we're going to struggle to get the resources needed, apart from doing our own little bit along the way. And that seems to me to be a major challenge, which if it isn't addressed, could just mean that we've got a sideshow when we need to be the main event.
Yeah, thank you.
That's a political conversation to have another night, I think, Kevin.
The thing is, I think what you're observing is very true, that there are, as I said in the earlier slides, obviously the sooner we'd started, the less we'd need to adapt so much. I mean, although some of these things are bigger than we realise, and we're we're coping with forces, you know, we don't know how things can trip and trigger, etc. But the bottom line is there needs to be a willingness by all of us to firstly acknowledge that there actually is a problem. Secondly, that we can, as well as trying to prevent it, we also need to adapt to the changing world that we live in. And thirdly, that we've got a willingness to collaborate to do that together, you know. Karen, did you want to say something?
I was watching a programme this morning, and they highlighted the Conservative Party conference. This is getting political, but anyway. And then there was two people with a Greenpeace, I think it's Greenpeace, with just a thing up about the climate, and they got so much. Well, it was horrible what the you know, politicians were saying about them, and they were dragged off apparently and not treated very well, and yet they weren't making a noise as far as I could see. They were just standing there, you know. And it's like these days you can't even protest, you know, even in a quiet way, just to say, you know, this isn't on. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
You think, Karen, they're a bit misguided in doing that? Because actually, without them being there, I think she'd have fallen flat on her face.
Well,
anyway, that's another conversation.
So anyway, thank you for sharing that. That's a fair point. But it does kind of back up what Kevin was saying a bit. Let's see if I can move down. Right, so have I missed a slide? So what sort of things we need to adapt to? This is me answering the questions. So it's getting hot out there. We need to adapt to the temperature increases. And I've got this slide that is from NASA and various other things. And it shows the last, is that 10? Yeah. So 10 hottest years in the last 11 years. So the 10 hottest years since 1850 have been in the last 11 years. And that doesn't even include 2022. Don't, obviously, you know, we had a very hot summer here, and this is a global temperatures, so we don't know what the overall temperature will be this year. But as you can see, I did try to find that chart where the, you know, a lot of the years are in red and a lot of years, there's very few years in blue, but this is the last decade, so it shows our general direction, doesn't it? And as you can see, we're obviously trying to keep the temperature below 1.5 degrees of warming, and at different times, different years, we're not far off that. I know we're talking about overall and an average temperature, but you can see it's increasing quite a bit there. So the other thing is, I can't see can anybody see the title on this slide? Because it's, what does it say?
What we need to adapt to: fire.
Oh, fire. Okay, so obviously, I thought when I was when thinking about this workshop at the beginning of the year, or in May, April, May time, that the main thing for our community to need to adapt to would be about flooding. And then we had those extremely high temperatures in the summer, but also we've seen what's happening to places, not just globally, but in Britain. The picture at the bottom is the homes that were destroyed in about 5 minutes in Wellington, so less than an hour in Wellington near London. Yeah, so I mean, climate change leads to more extreme weather. We talked about that. And as global temperatures rise, instances of devastating fire increase. We have seen lots of this across the earth in the last few years. The horrendous fires that we saw in Australia, and lots regularly in Greece and Spain and France. Terrible fires wiping out whole towns in about an hour in America, in California, and in Canada. A community was completely wiped off the map. I think it was last year. They all went to work one morning, you know, and obviously in Japan and China. So this fire, no discrimination really, and there's even been fires in the Arctic as well. I don't know about Antarctic, but definitely in the Arctic, which seems kind of counterintuitive, but you know, this is what's happening. And we saw the temperature I recorded in our back garden in the shade on that hottest day was 42 degrees. I can't remember what they're saying the UK temperature was, but you know, I know it's 42 degrees, and that was in the shade. And we're getting more flash fires starting to happen. Obviously, as I mentioned, these two places in America and Canada that were completely destroyed. And we saw the housing in the village in London, but other places as well around the southeast in the summer. So I think most nations across the world, but particularly in Europe, you know, we've really got to up our game in thinking, and this country, that this, just because we're not near the equator, that we won't necessarily avoid these devastating fires. We absolutely can experience them just like anyone else or anywhere else. Maybe not to the same extent as perhaps in some of the more traditionally warmer countries, but you know, it is happening in Britain as well. So, and then we also need to prepare for floods, and there's lots of different sorts of floods. So with the global temperature rising, increasing, the likelihood of flooding and flash flooding and storms increases also. And we've seen this across the world, obviously at the moment, and not just there, but we've seen the devastating floods in Pakistan, which has made nearly 33 million people homeless. And we've now see this regularly at different times throughout the UK. And we've seen it ourselves, which is the lower picture here in Wellingborough, but also in other communities across Northamptonshire. So it's not just in other parts of the world, so it does happen here too. And as the weather becomes more unpredictable, we're more likely to see this. But as I think someone said earlier, the other thing that sort of adds to this is the fact that many of our water courses or drainage systems or whatever are very blocked, they're not being cleared regularly. So, and we're getting more, for example, in the summer, the ground was so hard that if there was any flash flooding, it would have just washed off the ground really quickly, because, you know, it's just baking hard. I know that's a common thing, but anyway, so lots of issues about flooding for us, and I think that's going to be something we really need to think much more about within this community. And of course, with global warming, you get more droughts, and I think the drought this year has been akin to the drought that we had in 1976, but it doesn't mean to say we haven't had droughts through since then. We have had droughts in between. Also, some parts of the country get worse levels of drought. I'm surprised that Anglia Water Authority have said that we haven't really had a drought in the East Anglia area of England, since the rainfall is very low in this part of the country, but maybe they have taken steps to store water better. But there's a lot for us to consider as a community. So global warming is increasing the frequency of drought. Large parts of the earth are becoming uninhabitable. I think that's the right word. And some are becoming deserts. Many people are having to abandon their homes and their livelihoods and move. Particularly badly affected areas include Africa, Northern Africa, Middle East, large parts of Australia, and the UK is also experiencing drier years and drought more frequently. So the other things about sea levels. So global sea levels has risen about 10 centimetres since 1993, and it's rising about 3.5 millimetres a year. That might not sound a lot, but they're talking about, well, what's that? Jumping ahead of it, aren't I? So that might not sound a lot, but up until about 1993, the annual increase was 1.8 millimetres a year. This is globally. Obviously, it goes up and down in different parts of the world. The reasons for the increase, obviously, more melting ice caps going into the sea. And when water warms, it expands. So the more water and the hotter the seas are, the more the water will expand, and more floods and tidal issues are going to be a problem. So NASA says that more than half of sea level rise is due to sea temperature rise. The World Economic Forum suggests that by 2100, 410 million people could be vulnerable to sea level rise and coastal impacts because of that. And at the moment, they're estimating this would cost to remedy this about $5.5 trillion. And they suggest that a lot of the problems will be in Asia, but they also highlight there are problems in Northern Europe, in east of England being a very big vulnerable area, and obviously London and the Netherlands. Okay. Just on the whole coastal areas issues, obviously around Britain, I think the Committee on Climate Change that the government set up, in their risk assessment, they identified that England needs to expect to have a sea level rise of at least 1 metre. And the picture on the left, the picture of Britain on the left, is the areas that they think will be affected if it is just a 1 metre sea level rise, and the picture on the right are the areas that are going to be affected if it's a 4 metre sea level rise. But obviously we're not going to know. But what we can see around Britain, a lot of us, I imagine, do visit the East Coast, and you see, you're going on walks and the coastal path is disappearing. Lots of areas of the East Coast are rapidly disappearing. It's not invisible, it's very obvious when you're going there.
It's amazing to think, Marion, that like based on that and stuff that I've heard, that Peterborough could be a seaside. That's what we're talking about here.
Wellingborough by sea.
Yeah, and we'll actually have a tidal river.
Yeah.
So that's quite an amazing thing, really.
Yeah, I did find a video clip, or sort of a fast motion video clip of the British Isles and the British Isles and Ireland, and the levels of water rising depending on I can't remember what it was now. Yeah, so no, what would happen if obviously 1 metre rise, then 5, then 10, then it just kept going up, and it was showing the various parts that would disappear underwater at different times. So, but the area, I mean, these areas are quite significantly affected, but if you could see the Hook of Holland just across the sea, that is even more going to be affected. But there's some strategies that they're looking at in Holland. So the Environment Agency is saying the UK faces the choice of whether to abandon certain coastal areas, and I think a bit of the Environment Agency is doing a bit of that abandoning of certain coastal areas. You can see when you're going around the coast. So they're talking about which areas do they need to defend. And I don't know if you remember when we had the floods when David Cameron was Prime Minister. There's all those floods along the home counties, the River Thames along. And they were talking then, obviously they're saying about not enough water defences, but there were the conversations then about what areas should be defended, what areas shouldn't be defended. And I think when we had the floods in the Somerset levels, it was the same sort of conversation going on then. So there are a few issues about that, because obviously communities will be concerned about whether their area is being abandoned to the sea or abandoned to river water rises.
Of course, we have the issue in this part of the country that the country is actually sort of tipping to the east. So you'll find that sort of the western counties like Somerset, Wiltshire and all that are getting drier, and like the country's actually tipping on this side. So like that's just going to be exacerbated. And obviously that will mean we'll have to have less of a sea sort of rise, if you like, because like I say, this is more of a challenge. But yeah, the country's actually flipping, so not in our lifetime possibly, but Yeah, like I say, certainly, like in people's lifetime down in the west, they've noticed that their marshland have all dried up because literally the country's moving and the water's not sort of staying in those areas anymore.
Yeah. Kevin, did you want to say something or ask something?
Yes, I'm curious about that tipping description. That's not something I was aware of before. What's causing that tipping? Is it some geological movement or waste of
Exactly.
water?
We're on a I can't even say the word. We're on a geological plate that's just tipping, basically. So, like I say, with half the country's going up a bit, and the other half of the country's going down a bit. So, it is happening. Sort of, it's noticeable over the last 100 years that some areas of the country have got a lot drier because of this, and obviously we're losing it because it's sinking on this side, but it's not something that you'll notice sort of quickly unless you're sort of faced with it. But also then you've got the erosion problem that's particularly sort of the East Coast is suffering with. For instance, like Walton on the Naze, if you go there, that's gone back sort of, I don't know, nearly a quarter of a mile. You can sort of, like within my lifetime, I remember it being a lot further. The old coastal defences are now sort of underneath the sea, whereas when I was a kid, they were on top of a cliff.
I mean,
So it's quite frightening, really.
I've noticed going a couple of times to the East Coast, you know, trying to go on the coastal paths, and more coastal paths are just, oh, that's not there anymore, you know, it's gone. So, and obviously around various parts of Britain, we've had coastal paths are continuous, aren't they, around the coast? So, but there's now big holes appearing because a lot of them are being damaged by erosion and storms, you know. So, and that's another feature of the climate changes that we're experiencing. Just talking about Holland for a minute, and the Netherlands and Belgium, etc. Obviously, that was low lying anyway, and they've done a lot of work to reclaim land there. But they're sort of taking an approach to try and see if they can live with the water, you know, live with the water rather than fight against it. And their idea includes creating flood-proof homes. So looking at maybe floating homes, maybe start to, you know, a bit, I suppose, like Venice, where you've got, I don't know much about Venice, I know what I've seen, and maybe to a certain extent in Amsterdam, where there you might have more rivers than roads, perhaps, but you're finding ways to waterproof homes. But they are sort of looking at strategies around other things like, you know, planning evacuations, temporary relocation of people, strategic drainage areas, etc. And I'm sure the Environment Agency in this country may well be thinking about some of those things as well. But if I could show you the picture, the water inundation potentially in the lowlands in Holland and Belgium is much more severe, because they are even lower than parts of East Anglia. Anyway, so coastal areas a significant problem, and I mean we're just looking at Britain, but obviously there's around the world lots and lots of issues with this. You see lots of archipelagos that aren't even, if they're 1 meter sea rise, they won't be there anymore, you know. And I know I used to live in New Zealand, and a number of the Pacific Islands around New Zealand, the New Zealand government has now accepted the status of those people, many of them as refugees, because they are having to start to move off their islands because of the sea inundation for them. So there's lots of things really that are, you know, I can't, can anybody read the title for me? Climate change impacts
on the food system.
Yeah, so I mean, this is about food systems, but so looking at those circles on the left, so the sorts of things that we're going to need to think about, we're going to need to adapt to, are increased flooding. One thing I haven't mentioned is increased salinization, so that's increased salt on our land. And I think one of the little films I was watching was talking about issues where, you know, more sea was coming inland because it's breaking through different barriers, and how that's affecting some wetland areas by the sea and the some farming land by the sea. Erratic rainfall, increased storm intensity, and of course, even as we try to adapt, all of this, some of this can actually generate even more carbon emissions as well, because of different things happening. So if we have fires, you're going to get a lot of carbon emissions, a lot of carbon being released. Increased temperatures, increased desertification, we talked about that, and droughts. So just moving on. So what are the potential impacts on beings then? So clearly the potential impacts on animals are significant. I did find getting some of this information together a bit harrowing, really, particularly these two pictures. So the sheep there are in Australia, and obviously until very recently they've had a really severe drought in Australia, and you can see, you know, hardly any blades of grass around, but also how emaciated a lot of the animals are, and of course there for that polar bear. So we are seeing obviously a lot more warming in the Arctic and the Antarctic. I'm no expert to say I know where polar bears live. I don't know whether they come from the Arctic or the Antarctic, I don't know, but clearly they're running out of ice, particularly at different times of the year, and in summer there's almost a complete, in some areas there's a complete melting of ice in the Arctic. I don't think in the Antarctic though. So temperature rises will affect many animals and many species across the globe, and for many their habitat will be affected, just like our habitat is being affected. Their habitat will be affected, and many of them are already migrating where they can, and some are dying if they can't. So they'll be losing their main sources of food and water. Some will thrive because they're able to move to new environments. You know, I don't know if anybody watches the Ice Age films, you know, the cartoon films. That shows writ large the various migrations that have happened over centuries on the earth, and how many animals have realized that they've had to adapt and they've had to move, and that's exactly what's happening. And we're seeing more insects and more perhaps some more hardy beings moving north or south or wherever, depending on the environments that they thrive in better. And of course others are going to lose their lives, as we've seen. There's obviously massive, you know, starting to be massive increases in displacement and migration. And just as we have battles of resources as human beings, other beings and animals have battles for resources as well. So apart from just with us, so bringing beings in contact with each other as well as with humans. So this is some of the challenges that many other species are facing, and of course that adds to the mass extinctions that we're talking. I think they're talking about the 6th mass extinction at the moment. A lot to do with the way we live on the earth, but also even more now starting to happen with climate impacts. And then of course there's the impact on us as human beings. So, you know, we equally will lose our homes, our main food sources. Even the other day, I don't know if people saw in the news the situation at the moment in Somalia, but again they're having another massive drought and food shortages, which is extremely harrowing, isn't it, obviously for them. And people are losing their livelihoods. They're having to move off land that they might have farmed for centuries and going into the towns and cities where there often isn't enough work or food. Some people are losing wealth as part of that. Others, again, will be losing their lives. And then there's the stress for those people, like in this situation with these people. There are various islands that will be flooded for a few weeks of the year, or maybe a bit longer, then it goes down. So it's the stress of knowing when is it going to happen again, whether that's on the Pacific Islands or in Bangladesh or Pakistan or around the Philippines or lots of other countries where we have cyclones problems as well. And the same in America with all the hurricanes and tornadoes, etc., that they experience. So people it might look like they're living in a really beautiful place, but you only need things that we often don't experience in this country to happen for them, and then it's all thrown up in the air, isn't it? So the same problems are happening for us, displacement, and we're having to migrate, and the wars about resources as well as other things, but the resources are often a lot to do with it. So this is all a bit depressing, isn't it? I found it quite hard pulling all this stuff together, but I think maybe that's why some people don't actually want to look at it. But obviously we need to think about it and do more than think about it. We need to act about it. So as well as potentials on us as human beings generally and on other species, there'll be issues around our food, issues around disease, and how we actually go about sustaining life and where we do that. So, you know, obviously global warming is affecting our food growth, our livelihoods, it's affecting disease levels. So we're going to need to think about, I mean, every part of the world is thinking about this, but obviously where we sit in the UK, you know, the kinds of crops that we can grow in different areas are changing, and we can all see that in many ways, can't we? We'll need to reduce, because we've talked already as part of these workshops about needing to reduce animal farming because of the CO2 emissions. There's issues for us about pests not dying off because we're not getting any winters anymore. You know, we get winter, but it might be a lot of rain. But I think last winter we were lucky if we had 2 days of frost, you know, and that's unheard of. It's not many years, you know, 4 or 5 years ago, we would have had, you know, 11, I don't know, 20, whatever days of frost in a winter, but maybe more than that, 40 days of frost, but hardly any now, let alone snow. I mean, we stopped having snow quite a long time ago. So a lot of pests and insects that we usually rely on the weather to either that they hibernate or they die off are not dying off. And some of that is affecting our crops, etc., as well as ourselves. Some farmers in the UK are taking their crops indoors. I can't remember where I heard this. I was away at the weekend, and I think one gentleman was saying that he knows farmers down in Kent that are moving their salad, lettuce production systems indoors. Not obviously the weather's getting warmer, but the chances of crops being wiped out by hailstorms is also increasing as well. So, you know, we might be thinking, oh, let's Britain become the wine growing nation of the earth, or one of them. But, you know, we've also got the impacts of what happens when. So they're looking at bringing things under cover now. I think we've seen a lot of that, haven't we, with the big polytunnels that have been around in the UK now for a while. So others are trying out crops usually only grown in warmer climates, so they're starting to do that. Numbers and types of disease is predicted to increase as well. So already food growers and farmers are starting to think differently about the crops, but also how to look after them. But with this as well come other diseases moving north, such as malaria. You know, if we're going to have wetter conditions in some areas, that's going to be more of a problem as well as others. So I suppose all of this is actually thinking about the potentials and the likely risks, and that's why the government has redone their risk assessments in relation to climate change. So what about Wellingborough then? So I put a few notes down about the things I'm aware of in relation to Wellingborough. So I'm chuntering away and we probably need a tea break. I'll just do this one and then we'll have a little break. So challenges in Wellingborough. Well, we've had more flash rain events. I mean, this year we haven't had a lot of rain really, but in the last few years we've had flash rain events where it all comes all of a sudden. And that's happening not just in the summer, but sometimes, yes, in the spring, but also in the autumn, and sometimes even in the winter. I mean, looking at the weather on the television sometimes, when you're seeing thunderstorms in winter, this is a bit weird, isn't it? Thunderstorms in winter. But at the same time we get flash floods, we're also getting decreasing rainfall, and this is one of the worst areas affected in the UK in terms of diminishing rainfall. Hardly any snow for a long time. Did used to, when I lived on the west of the county, we used to get a little bit of snow over there, but in Wellingborough we don't seem to get any snow. And the winters are getting a bit wetter and greyer, a lot of grey, some wet, but no frost and snow. I've mentioned about the insects. Bird migration patterns have changed. I think many of us have noticed that. Plants growing out of season, you know, what was it this year? I think I saw raindrops appearing before Christmas. Not raindrops, snowdrops appearing before Christmas. Yeah, big pardon. Which I couldn't believe. And I think I saw some daisies in the park in January. So, you know, where are we at? And obviously we're getting, even in Wellingborough, we're getting more instances of excessive heat. And our buildings and our infrastructure cannot cope with this. Our roads are made for average temperatures, but we're not getting average temperatures anymore. And of course, we all know about how bad the drainage systems are in our communities and the problems that's causing. So, and all of this is adding greater pressures to our health and social care systems in our communities and other things as well. But I mean, are there any other thoughts that people have got about impacts on our community in terms of climate consequences, things that we might need to have to adapt to?
I think one of the big things are sort of more pandemics, although obviously that's a lot to do with our exploitation of nature. But things like bugs, diseases might have been killed out by cold weather, hot weather, whatever. They're just not anymore, are they? So a lot more diseases, a lot more sort of pandemics in sort of relatively temperate, sort of wet, sort of winters. Things will sort of spread quicker.
Any other thoughts on this?
Climate change is transforming the world and our lives.
Can everybody hear this all right? See
Yeah.
it? Hear it? Good. Right, I'll carry on then.
The ice caps are melting and sea levels are rising. Bushfires are raging in Australia. Hurricanes are devastating the Americas. No matter what part of the world you live in, you've probably felt the effects of climate change in some way, whether through flooding, heat waves, crop failures, or warming. Perhaps you drive an electric car, that you've stopped eating meat, or started thinking twice about buying fast fashion. As we take better care of our oceans, forests, and soil, Mother Nature is doing her bit too, by keeping some of the greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. Of course, all this is great and necessary, but it's no longer enough. We need to take our efforts to the next level. It's time for full-on climate adaptation. In plain English, that means adapting to the changes that have already begun. Adaptation means reducing our vulnerability to rising sea levels, extreme weather, and food shortages. It also means taking advantage of new opportunities, like longer growing seasons and increased crop yields in some places. People could grow rice in parts of Africa, or make wine in Scandinavia. Makes sense, right? So we urgently need to step up our efforts to adapt, because the impact of global warming is only going to increase. We need to adapt now. And here's the good news. Humans have adapted to climate change before, and we're getting better at it. All over the world, we're building better flood defenses. We're anticipating hotter weather. We're greening our roofs and gardens. We're using porous paving to deal with excess water, improving water retention and use. In Bangkok, they've turned an abandoned railway bridge into an elevated park that helps soak up increasing rainfall while reducing air pollution.
In Vietnam's Mekong Delta, where sea level rise has inundated rice paddies and ruined harvests, farmers are reducing losses by planting earlier and switching to new, hardier varieties. But we can and must do much more. Leaders in government and business need to radically rethink how they make their decisions. They need to understand the risks of climate change and take account of these risks in their plans, policies, and investments. And society needs to dig deep into its pockets to finance the necessary adaptations. Okay, so much for the lofty language. What are we really talking about here? Here are a few examples of the kinds of things we need to do next. In Bangladesh, coastal cities could install an early warning system for cyclones so that a young couple will hear the siren and be able to get their family to safety in time. At macro level, that same system could save their community 10 times the money they paid for it. In Zimbabwe, a farmer could grow a new type of maize that's more resistant to drought. In Denmark, engineers could redesign city streets to make them less prone to flooding. And in Indonesia, a business executive could use water risk data and maps to help him decide where to invest his money. Meanwhile, his government could plant mangrove forests to protect villages from flooding and create rich fishing grounds as a bonus. Feeling inspired? Good. Because all this isn't just up to world leaders, mayors, and the people who write the checks. It's also up to you and me. Each and every one of us has a part to play. Our actions don't have to be fancy or high-tech. They can be cheap and practical. A resident of Manchester can green her tiled garden so that heavy rains will drain into the soil and the trees will keep her home cooler. An urban planner in Colombia can paint roofs white to deflect dangerous heat. Yeah. And did you know that some trees are more fire resistant than others, so they can help protect homes from wildfires? Adaptation will pay off for all of us. We'll save lives, protect nature, reduce inequalities, and create new opportunities. We'll even be promoting growth and development while we're at it. Our work is just beginning. Join us as we adapt our way into the future.
Is that on the video? Is that Marion?
Oh, there's Jonathan. Sorry, caught me in mid-biscuit. Did you see that film, Trish and John?
Most of it.
Some of it we'd already covered in the conversations, but I was showing that because I wanted to show some of the things we can actually do about the challenges that we talked about before the break. Because it can feel a bit, what's the word? Depressing. But there are lots of things that we can start to do, and he's just given us a few ideas in relation to that. I'll just go back to the slides. Can everybody see this, and can you hear me? Thank you. We lost you for a while, Trish and John. Yeah. Okay, so we've heard some of the a lot of the challenges, and we've heard a few ideas about some things that we can do that, you know, are possible globally, nationally. I'm just going to, well, what about locally? What can we do locally to help help us prevent this? I mean, we've got a number of slides here about what can we do to help prevent flooding in our area. What practical things can we do? What practical things, I mean, we can talk about the coastal sea defences one in a minute. We'll just focus on this area first. What things can we do to help prevent fires? in our area. How can we cope with droughts? What things can we do to help cope with drought? So those four main ones. Yeah, okay. So, okay, stop that. So what do people think? What actions can we take to help prevent flooding in our communities, of our homes, of our businesses in this area? Any thoughts from anybody? Let's have a bit of a sharing.
I think the planners have got to make sure that new housing estates really do take into account drainage. They've got this sustainable urban drainage systems. Have we heard about that? Those things? SUDS? Have you covered SUDS?
Can't remember actually. I think Greg, the other Greg, not this Greg, Greg Moore, when he spoke about retrofitting homes, might have mentioned something about them, but if you would like to enlighten us a bit further.
Well, there's they've had it for a while. Before you put it into the drainage system, you try to absorb as much locally when you're building a new estate, and they will build special waterways and maybe a pond, get reed beds, and try to integrate as much water absorbing planting in an estate that you possibly can. It's a complete opposite of the way that they do it, which is to tarmac everything and put individual homes cheek by jowl and one to another.
Yeah, sorry, I noticed up on Stanton Cross, and when they built in on Saxby Park, and there used to be the old Saxby site here in Wellingborough, they put a water pond area that was then the idea to hold any drainage down, because it's on a bit of a hill anyway, to catch that rain. And the same, I think there's about 5 or 6 of those large lake areas at the bottom of the housing in Stanton Cross. So they're starting to do that much more.
But the developers need to be encouraged by the planners to do it in a more I mean, they do the bare minimum of doing it in order to act as a sort of temporary storage for it.
Yeah.
Done properly, you don't get water storm drains. It just dissipates through the ground.
So we need then better action from planners around.
They just need a lot of encouragement. Yeah. So as soon as the plans come up, if someone scrutinises them, it won't have any impact, but at least you can raise awareness of the fact that you are creating a potential flood risk, and it's not helping anybody when it goes straight into and overloads the sewage system, and you get these releases of polluted water.
So Greg's saying about them following national flood management measures. Do you want to say a little bit about that, Greg? You're muted, by the way.
Yeah. Yes, I would encourage people to look at the Northants website on the videos there, because the Executive Advisory Panel today, the one from 6th of October, they meet to talk about climate change, environment and growth. And one of the topics today that was talked about in depth was flooding and the RAIN project, which at the moment is focusing on Hoppers Brook, which is in the Brigstock, Desborough, Sudborough line, that whole catchment area. And the other catchment area that they're working on is Wootton Brook, which is south of Northampton. So those are very macro scale projects in the water, what do you call it? The water catchment areas for those brooks. And the reason apparently why they are working on the brooks and trying to protect housing in those areas is because those brooks feed the larger rivers. So hopefully they can slow down the flow in the brooks before they merge with the larger rivers.
So,
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you. So, I mean, one thing that came to me as I was bringing some of these materials together for tonight's presentation was obviously there's a lot of climate stuff kind of just happens, but a lot of it is predictable. We can now, like today, we've been able to think of things that are more likely to happen than not if you take a risk management approach. And obviously the government's done its own risk management approach. I don't know if North Northants Council or West Northants Council has done its own risk management approach, but I think the whole thing around planning and thinking when there's new developments in our areas, it just seems to be, how do I describe this? There's a lot of add-on kind of thinking going on rather than thinking ahead of time. How do we live our lives planning in those likely consequences of climate change rather than, oh, it's a surprise to us, you know what I mean? It should not be a surprise at this stage of the game. So how are we much more proactive about designing new developments or addressing problems that are already in the communities around, for example, the whole drainage system in the town centre? That was a big problem the other year when we had the flash rain in June. I think it was it 2020 or 2019? Can't remember. So it's like trying to not predict, but having good estimates about what is likely to happen and taking practical action to respond to that ahead of time and planning that into our activities. In a way, almost like we as residents, but also the councils are thinking, well, doing what we're doing, what things are likely to happen in our areas given the consequences of climate change, and how can we plan for those within our general ways of meeting our needs. Am I making any sense?
Yeah.
Harry?
I think some planning is being done. We had a talk from Anglia Water representative last week as part of Great Big Green Week, and they've got really ambitious plans. And I know that the Google network have got sort of big plans. So I think that the utilities probably do have a 25-year plan. But I trained as a planner, and I worked initially as part of a regional planning team. So the country was divided up into sort of big regions. So there was the southwest of England, which would go from London across to Essex down to sort of due south of London. I was working in the West Midlands, which was all of the counties around Birmingham, and we used to discuss all kinds of things like transport, where the buses go to. It included all the utilities, and it also included planning, and that function was just disbanded. The planning and architecture departments in the council, every council would have had an architect and a planner who knew what was happening in their area and would liaise with their neighbouring town planners, and all of that was thrown away in the 1980s. It was privatized and the skill set was lost, and it now has to come to us as citizens to take that role, because with the best will in the world, the council has got statutory obligations and does not have the officer capacity to do the big picture stuff that we've got to do.
Yeah, the strategic plan.
And I had not thought as a project, adaptation is probably the most vital thing that we've got to get people thinking about. It's probably easier to think of adaptation than it is of not eating meat, in a way.
Yeah.
You know,
I
sort of,
mean,
yeah.
just on a very practical level, you know, as I say, one of the things I thought was more likely in our town is about flooding. And I noticed, I was talking to Karen and some of my neighbours about this a few months ago when we were doing our street party. You know, we live in a terraced street. Somebody was doing something on their guttering, and we started to look at our guttering, and we noticed on our side of the road, there's one downpipe per every 3 houses. And on the other side of the road, there's one downpipe every 4 houses. And, you know, and obviously we're terraced housing, so the roofs are all connected. And so if we do get more and more, you know, flash rain, as it were, then that is just going to be like, when we had that bad one a few years ago, I mean, it was just like waterfalls off the gutters. It was so much, it wasn't even going anywhere near the drown pipe. And it was just coming straight over. But things like homeowners or landlords actually putting in more downpipes, and a lot of the water coming down is just going onto the paths. It's not, or going to soak away. It's not actual drainage system or anything. So, and there's a lot of Victorian housing within this town, as there are in many towns in this area. And you can imagine that, you know, the water just comes straight off the roof, over the edge or down the pipe, onto the road, onto the paths. I know that's the way it's been designed, but I think we have to look at how is that going to work if we get more flash rain instantly.
But also you're not getting the benefit in your water storage tank, your water butt. So you've got nothing to put on your flower pots. Well, I don't know how big a flower garden. Have you got any space for growing things?
Yeah, I mean that's the other thing, because down the allotment, you know, a lot of us are using water from the mains. But you know, maybe we've all got to start thinking about how we catch the water when it comes. When I lived in New Zealand, they didn't get much rain on the top of the South Island, but they made sure they caught it when it came, and so as a result, it didn't feel like we were having water shortages, even though there was
if you've lived in a country where you've had to pay a lot of money for water, then you're far more frugal with it. And we've never had that tradition. We just turn the tap on and let it run. And,
But if you think,
but sorry, I was just going to ask about your street, because it's quite interesting. You can get quite deep gutters these days. So you take down what you've currently got, you put your deep gutters in, and everybody gets a downpipe, and everybody gets a water barrel.
no, we could do that. We could have water barrels in the front of everybody's house, couldn't we? And
well, you can get really nice ones. I mean, they're not just barrel shaped. You can get quite discreet rectangular ones that they.
I encourage my neighbour.
Sorry
to interrupt. I encourage my neighbour to put a water butt down his downpipe thing, so he was very happy with that. And yeah, I mean, we could look to do that as well. But this is it. It's sort of not just getting the water away from the property, it's catching what you can for your own garden. I mean, you know, this summer we did use some at the tap, but we ran out quite quickly from our water butts, but not on the allotment. We actually had quite a lot on the allotment.
We did well at the allotment, Marion, because I planned for it. Do you know what I mean? That's the point.
But that's the point, isn't it? And I think, I know I've gone off piste a bit, but I think the whole point of planning is at the heart of really focusing on adaptation. You know, it's easier to plan in advance than sort of wait for catastrophes to happen and then try and sort them out.
But our planning system is built up of local plans.
Yeah, I don't just mean land planning, or it's more like emergency planning or that sort of more strategic planning. But I get your point, Harry, that and I think it's very much the case with our primary council at the moment here, and it's probably the same in West Northants, the priorities are so very much on that high level statutory functions.
Well, sorry, I was just going to say that the planning is based on local plans and a government directive to build so many thousand homes. And it's all development driven rather than anything to do with they've got this paradox of the national planning policy framework where you've got to balance various demands, but the third demand is sustainable development, so that you don't do anything today that messes up the chance of someone doing something different tomorrow. And that's it's complete paradox. Everything that they do by way of physical infrastructure development is making a mess of things for people coming tomorrow.
Yeah, and obviously a lot of the local plan structures, which I've tried to get my head around. I used to know them more years ago. That, you know, your advanced planning, you're talking about 20, 30 years. So climate change and adaptation requirements should be writ large within that. That should be the main focus about, yes, we want to do development in a community, and meet need, but how does that sit with climate impacts and the way that they could land within our community, as well as also the climate reduction aims that we want to have. So I was surprised they were doing a consultation on a part of the local strategic plan a few months ago, and they weren't really saying enough about, you know, because you would expect it in the heart of that planning, wouldn't you? Because it is for 20, 30 years in advance, etc. But there wasn't enough really being said about it. So
it's been driven by development priorities, the developers, and who's going to put the money in, and where will the council tax get topped up from these new homes, the business rates, the contribution of that. It's about, you know, that local government finance is being stripped back so that they have to generate all their own revenue by 2025, is it?
Well, it's been a lot. In fact, I think they were aiming. Well, a lot of money's already been taken out. The amount they get from central government has dropped off cliff edge, really. And you know, so we're not. I can't remember the percentages, but I know they were aiming for about only 10% of funds.
Well, they want to wind it up altogether during this decade. But it means that the council is scratching around, wanting to build new estates, wanting to get that those tax income, because they've got no other source of income.
Yeah, and then that doesn't work at all with what we're trying to do around climate adaptation, etc. I'm just mindful of the time. I've got a little bit more to do. We've got 5 minutes.
I'll stop talking. Sorry.
No, it's all right. I mean,
yeah, very interesting, Harry.
I couldn't try to think of the different actions we need to take. I think it's sort of something we could have a discussion on in its own, really, because there's so many. What sort of practical things could we do? Now I'm asking that question, but you know, I think it needs a bit of time for us all to really consider that, because there's some things we can do personally. There's some things perhaps we could do as communities. There's some things we'd be looking for the councils to do, but if they don't do it, then how do we do it in communities as well? You know, there's things that business can do, but I think we need more time to actually consider all this, and it's quite fundamental to us being able to cope, because a lot of costs will come to us if we don't start to address these things, as well as some of the other negative things I mentioned. Anyway, going back quickly to the slides. I mean, actually, just before I do, is it okay if we go over for a few minutes, because we've only got 4 minutes left, and there were some of the windy up things I wanted to do for this series. Is that okay? Will you allow me to 9:15? Is that all right with everybody? Okay, so I'll plow on. Okay, there we go. Right, so I hope everybody can see that then. So other things that we can do to help us better adapt: planning. So I talked about planning, and obviously there's local government planning, but there's just planning, you know, planning what we're thinking about, planning what we're doing. Thinking also how nature can support us as we adapt, you know, trying to work to the strengths of nature and the typography of where we live. You know, what things around us can help us to adapt well to the challenges that are coming from climate change. Nature is very good. I mean, you know, obviously, let's talk about flooding. One of the major things that can help reduce flooding, apart from not building on floodplains, is making sure upstream we're really supporting tree growth in and around, not just on riverbank areas, but sort of near that. So when rain falls, it's being held a bit more before it goes into the watercourses. I'm not an expert on all this, but actually having less sort of land where water can just run off quickly, as it were, but more, and obviously more tree growth. So actually that helps not just in holding on to water in and around the roots, but also in taking in more carbon emissions as well. Getting people together to partner and get involved and think things through together. So I think very much the Climate Action Project would, this would perhaps something we're going to be doing, is thinking, well, how do we adapt in our communities? And of course, by adapting, as I've just said about the examples to do with planting extra trees in the right places upstream, as it were, you do then also start to increase the ability to take more carbon in, more CO2 in, by planting those trees and other green nature solutions. So there's lots of different ways that we can better adapt, and then just a few ideas. What benefits can actually taking the bull by the horns, as it were, and doing adaptation, what benefits that can it have to our communities? Well, for some people, they'll be able to carry on living where they are if we're prepared to change some of the things we do. Their lives and livelihoods could be protected or supportively transitioned and sustained by making changes early. I mean, this is in, if we actually start doing some planning about some of this, not only can we mitigate, adapt and protect in relation to some of the things that are likely to happen, but we can also put plans in to support people if they do happen. If we make changes early, we can help more people, save more money in the long run. We can stave off some of the worst impacts of climate change in our communities, and hopefully make our lives and the lives of other beings in our communities and in our area better as well. So really working hand in hand with each other, but also hand in hand with nature. Can we actually do anything to reverse climate change? So if we get better at predicting and planning rather than just acting or responding, could we even reverse climate impacts? And there's a little film I've put on there, and I'm not going to show it now because this film is about design, how to design in good structures, positive structures that help prevent some of these climate impacts that we've talked about today. So if you want to, as usual, I'm sure Jonathan will put these slides on the website, and then you'll be able to just go and have a look at some of these films as well. That's the only other one I haven't shown, actually. So what qualities are we going to need to nurture within our communities as people to help us to adapt and respond to the climate emergency? Well, we're going to need to develop personal and community resilience. And we talk about resilience a lot, but actually being able to put up with stuff and be able to cope. And I think we've all learned a lot about coping with stuff over the years, in recent years. But it's learning how to also cope with the heartache of what we're seeing and experiencing. So, there was terrible, obviously across the world, there's so many appalling things we're seeing where, like, for example, in the Pakistan situation at the moment, horrendous. And when that flooding hits somewhere like Wellingborough, it's not on that sort of scale, but when whoever it hits, when it's people, their homes or their businesses, it's devastating. The kind of suffering that people experience is hard for them to cope with. And not really comparable, but they are about people, all of us, wherever we live, having to deal with some very, very difficult things for ourselves. I guess the quality around positivity, knowing that we can make an impact, and I'm sure that each of us wonders about that sometimes, but where we can be prepared and start planning, and we were starting to do that through this group, and hopefully we'll be able to do more and support other groups to do the same. But if we can keep plugging away and be positive and believe that we can make the difference. The qualities of cooperation and collaboration, you know, tackling the things together, being creative as well. You know, some of these challenges we don't have the answers for, but if I feel reassured that if we were to sit down and think things through, we can come up with some really good answers and really good solutions to some of the challenges we face. And I see that all the time. We're very creative as people in our community, but also human beings are very creative and resourceful anyway. So actually freeing up that whole sense of creativity, being helpful and supportive to each other and helping us all to succeed together. And of course, loads of buckets of determination, because we're all having to push through with this, where our structures around us just seem to not be awake at all to this, or they're, to be fair, they are struggling with other challenges too. So, you know, it's taken a lot of determination for many people to keep focused and encourage other people to start being focused on this, and big bucket loads as well of compassion for each other. So there's some of the qualities we're going to need to have to get through and to work together well on this. So I guess the invitation to us all, if we want to have better ways of living, because yes, we need to mitigate, but also we need to create ways of living well together. And adaptation is going to be at the heart of that. So it's not just adapting away from what we don't want, it's moving towards the sorts of ways of living and being that we'd like to create as well. So rather than just avoiding the negative, it's moving towards how we'd really like to be. So that's that whole part about adaptation. Are there any questions on that? Any thoughts at all before I do the next little bit?
I think you've missed that actually a lot of this is political choices, that we have a government, both locally and nationally, that seem hell-bent on trying to cut taxes and concentrate on some sort of weird notion that we're all going to be saved by a growing economy, when like we want almost not the opposite, but we want to have a completely different focus, that we need to have a more compassionate economy, a more a better way of working that works for everybody in the country and includes everybody, not just the 5% that get paid very well. And they are political choices. They've decided in this county area particularly to basically charge a lot less tax. So of course they offer a lot less services, and these services are essential for us to move forward on a lot of these big issues that we're looking at. And say like that's both nationally and locally, but particularly locally, with the focus on tax.
Yeah, I think that, yeah, we are, many of us are struggling with this just not being a priority, and for the powers that be, as it were. Yeah, I mean, there's quite a lot I could say about that, but it's like a lot of people just haven't woken up. They're still living in the business as usual land, even though the last thing that we are experiencing at the moment is business as usual. It's very, very not usual, isn't it? But yeah, you know, not really thinking about how we can positively be creative, etc. And I don't know what the answers to that are, apart from communities and us, people like us, doing this sort of stuff. You know, I did go to a conference at the weekend, and there were some really, really positive ideas. I went to the Green Party conference at the weekend, and I was hearing about lots of climate commissions and various other action groups like this, and action forums that are being created, non-party political, but just communities and people coming together to start taking action in their own areas and creating climate hubs and various other things. Some really positive work that this project that we're doing would not look out of place with. One thing that was clear, though, that was quite a lot of those authorities were, the councils themselves were taking a lot of action and leading, leading around retrofitting. I mean, I heard about Stroud District Council that has set up a retrofitting and college, a retrofitting and renewables college, where they're training young people to be able to do the sort of renewables work that, you know, the retrofit work that we talked about as part of this programme. Work down in Lewis, in Leeds, across Humberside, lots and lots of different places across the country doing things, some really good examples. So that was quite heartening, actually. I don't, you know, over the years, we want people to take part and we want the powers that be to take part, but we can't necessarily drag them to do it. But we do, and we know that we're suffering because they're not there. But at the same time, hopefully they will start to come. But at least we can get the ball rolling, and that's what we're doing here, isn't it? Just moving on a little bit, because I don't want to go past the time, the extra time I'd asked for. So just a bit of a summary really around the workshops and the whole programme. So this is the 11th session. This is the last one. I hope you've enjoyed all of them, found them useful and helpful. Probably some topics more interesting to you than some of the others. We've had a good number of people wander through our sessions, and I just wanted to ask a little bit about, you know, maybe get a bit of feedback from you. But the first thing I wanted to say is, you know, what we do next as part of the climate action work, where we're going to listen to what we've learned in relation to these workshops. And since the project started, we're going to hold, we decided to hold a couple of climate report back conversation sessions. So we did our climate conversations at the beginning of the project. And we want to now, after doing those conversations, after doing the training and doing these workshops, is actually go back to some of those people and anyone else that wants to come and hold some sessions in person to see, you know, report back to people what we've found out and to see what other people, you know, what else people would like to learn about and need help with. We also said after the workshops, we'd identify maybe 2 or 3 or 3 or 4 areas that people might want to specifically work on. You know, we hoped that we'd have an army of folk that had taken part in the workshops, and actually some people that were ready to start doing some action on their own properties or their own business. So maybe if you want to think about if there's anything that, any of the couple of the topics that we've been looking at that we'd like to go into more depth with and actually do some practical work on in our community. We also talked about setting up the climate forum, and we're hoping to be able to either set that up or join in, because last week the Wellingborough Town Council I've decided to set up a climate action group or a climate action working group that is going to meet quarterly and look at enable groups and businesses from across the town to work with the council and hopefully North Northants Council to consider start doing some planning around climate action in our communities. So we may have the general forum or we may join in with that work. We're just going to see really. And we also plan to go and visit some more groups and different and engage with more people that perhaps haven't been able to take part in these workshops, but are still really interested to learn about the action that they can take towards climate. So there's some of the things that we're planning as part of the Wellingborough climate action work. Are there any questions on those at this point in time? No, okay. So I had a couple of questions for you, and I know we've got 4 minutes before it's 1:15. So given what I just said, were there any other topics that we've looked at that people would like us to do a bit more work on, either as groups of people or individually? So maybe that's something to think about. So I think people are interested. I know we'll probably write to some of the attendees, or all the attendees, and ask these questions. The other thing is, you know, I'd like, if it's possible, for a little bit of feedback again we might not have time to do it now because we've only got like 4 minutes. But if I can invite you to, when Jonathan puts the slides up on the website, if you have a look at these questions and give us a bit of feedback about the workshops, you know, how it's been for you, which sessions you enjoyed the most, which ones you enjoyed the least. Would you like to have some more? Because there's so many of the topics that we could cover. But also maybe we could have regular meetings about how we do something beyond just informing ourselves, you know, how we can do more, really. If we had some more sessions, would you like them to be in person or on Zoom? And what other session topics could we cover? You know, there's a lot we didn't cover. Yeah. So there's a few things for you to think about. A bit of news. So I've mentioned about the town council. Oh, that's the third one. So Wellingborough Climate Action Project now has received some additional funding from SEMLEP as part of some work we were doing with them for Glamis Hall. Glamis Hall created its own carbon reduction and sustainability plan, and we're planning to set up a new energy advice and climate action service from January, given the big things that we've heard about people needing specific help and advice, either on their own home or when they want to transition their own business. I'm going on training next week and be going on 4 courses in the next few weeks to learn how to do domestic energy assessment and non-domestic energy assessment, so that when we do the advice service from the new year, that we'll be able to do specific advice using the energy scoring system of the energy performance certificates to help people. I've mentioned about town council. Myself and Simon Cox, I don't know if people know Simon Cox, he's the coordinator of North Northamptonshire Business Network. We've managed to get a meeting with Councillor Harriet Pentland and with George Candler, who's one of Greg's bosses. He's a director of, is it Place, Greg?
Yes.
Yeah, so we've got a meeting with him at the beginning of November, him and Harriet, to discuss, you know, actually the plans that North Northants Council are doing, but also report back from this project. We're looking forward to that. And we've had a little bit of success getting some other monies in. I don't know if you want to say a little bit about that, Jonathan, for the eco group.
Yeah, definitely. We've gone for like quite a bit of money to try and help us sustain a new project. We've hired a room 24/7 at Glamis Hall, turned it into what we're calling the Eco Hub, so we can run lots of environmentally friendly and community activities in there. There's a lot of stuff that isn't happening in Wellingborough, and obviously we've talked about it on numerous occasions, that there's not enough going on about the environment. We want to sort of be the place, the go-to place in the town for all of the environmentally friendly projects, but also community projects, trying to get people involved in many different ways, be they crafting, be they like home education. We've got a couple of bits like that going in. But it's a really sort of, it's already buzzing. It's only been going a month. But we're aiming for it to be a real sort of asset for the community, and it's being supported by North Northants Council, which is brilliant. The town council, I believe, are going to support us as well, and also Great Wall Homes are looking to partner with us on many of their projects, particularly their warm homes initiatives, and are looking to financially support us as well. So the actual spectrum of stuff that we should be able to offer there moving forward will be fantastic. Like I say, we're starting from a very small base of doing it one afternoon a week to sort of filling it sort of a lot more, but it's going to be sort of a real sort of asset for the community, like I said.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Jonathan. That's great news. I just wanted to finish off really. So today, I don't know, Greg may know about this and maybe Harry as well. The other week when we were talking about sustainable transport, I think it was Alison Holland I met her today, so I'll remember her name now, from Brightways joined us, and she was talking about the Is Valley Strategic Partnership and the Greenway. And I was invited to go along and represent the Climate Action Project at a meeting today of the launch of the Is Valley Strategic Partnership Plan, which is very interesting. And I didn't realise so many parts of the Is Valley I've actually lived in, so that's quite good. But one of the colleagues there today was talking about the Greenway as well and the plans with that. So they're planning to create a path, cycle path, walking path, wheeling path from Corby all the way down to Wellingborough, and obviously, or Wellingborough all the way to Corby, which would be brilliant. But starting section by section along the River Is. Today we had this event at Wicksteed Park, and they were talking about some work they've started doing at the sort of south end of the park in terms of rerouting part of the Slade Brook to reconnect with the Is Brook. So it was a really interesting day, and I think there's a lot of potential is going to come out of this overall strategic plan and the ways that we can engage with it. Obviously, the Is Brook does come through Wellingborough and then joins the River Nen, and is it's a big part of the ward that this is my ward, Is Brook ward. So there's some real potentials around supporting nature projects, and also they seem very committed to doing some of the discussions work that we've been talking about today around adaptations, around enhancing nature in response to climate change, and also I guess some sort of carbon sink, storing CO2 things by planting more, etc. But obviously that's done in an appropriate pattern. But anyway, it's a good meeting, and I think there's some real potentials for the Climate Action Project and the Eco Group and others to link with that, and not just around Wellingborough. There are friends there from Kettering and Corby, and there's so many ways that we can all get connected into that work, hopefully for the better of the area, and to really make some headway around climate adaptation. Anyway, so that's me. Are there any more thoughts or questions or observations this evening? Okay, so just to say a massive thank you for joining us over the last 11 sessions. I know that maybe not all of you have been to all of them, but you do have access to all the material. So if there's anything you missed, it's all been recorded and put on our website. But thank you very much for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed all the sessions. I think for me, it's been, and I know for myself and Jonathan, it's often been hard work to get our heads into some really big topics and try and summarize them. But I hope that you've found it rewarding. We found it rewarding doing this. I've learned a lot from getting all the materials together. I can't speak for Jonathan, but maybe he has too. And I hope you all too, because that was the reason of us doing this as well. So thank you very much for coming. Is there anything else anybody wants to say before we finish?
I just think thank you very much, Marion, Jonathan, and I'm very pleased to have met you, Greg, the other day. That was very exciting.
Thank you both for joining us. Thank you to all of you, rather. And we will have a think about more sessions, because I think this has been very helpful. Maybe some of the topics will be slightly smaller, so we'll be able to comfortably talk about them within 2 hours and have a bit more of a discussion. And as we do them, we would like to do some of them in person as well. So we'll come back to you. But thank you, everybody, and have a good rest of the evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for all your work, Jonathan.
And thank you for your work, Marion. Crikey.
Thank you, Karen, for attending, and Marion and Jonathan, well done. So hopefully